In Pennsylvania, the night manager of a fast food restaurant is found tragically murdered, the apparent victim of a robbery gone bad. For 15 years, police are unable to identify a suspect. The trail goes cold, and the file is buried. But then, an elite group of forensic experts agrees to take on the case. What they uncover is not a random act, but a deeply personal story of passion, control, and a lie that lasted for more than a decade. This is the story of the case that refused to stay closed. If you believe in cold cases finally being solved, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more investigations. The year was 1984. The cold in Falls Township, Pennsylvania, was a physical weight, a presence that pressed against the glass and seeped through the door frames. It was the 4th of February, and the sky was a deep, starless purple that promised a bitter dawn. Arthur, a man who measured his life in coffee spoons and inventory sheets, pulled his thin jacket tighter. His breath plumed in front of him, a tiny, fleeting cloud in the stillness. He was the morning manager. His shift began before the sun, and this morning was no different from any other, or so he had thought. He crunched across the frozen parking lot, his keys already in hand. The metal was so cold it stung his skin. He reached the front entrance of the fast food restaurant, a place of forced cheer and bright colors that looked muted and sad in the pre-dawn light. He aimed his key toward the lock, but his hand stopped. The door was already ajar. A sliver of blackness, no wider than a man's hand, separated the glass door from its frame. Arthur froze. This was wrong. This was profoundly wrong. Terry Brooks, the night manager, was meticulous. She was the one who checked the locks twice. She was the one who followed the procedures to the letter. A wave of excuses washed over him. Maybe she had just stepped out to her car. Maybe a delivery had come early. But the parking lot was empty, save for his own vehicle. He pushed the door. It swung open with a dreadful, silent ease. "Terry?" he called out. His voice was too loud in the consuming quiet. The air inside was colder than it should have been. The heating had been turned off. The only light came from the faint green glow of the menu boards and the red emergency exit signs, which cast a sickly pall over the empty tables. The restaurant was perfectly still. It was too still. The normal hum of the refrigerators and the ice machine was absent. "Terry?" he called again, stepping inside. The lock clicked shut behind him, a sound of finality that made his heart jump. He moved past the counter. He looked at the cash registers. They were untouched. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing seemed missing. A flicker of relief, thin and fragile, rose in his chest. Maybe she had simply forgotten. Maybe she was in the office, having fallen asleep at the desk. Terry was 25, driven, and worked harder than anyone he knew. She was saving up, engaged to be married to that intense young man, Scott. She had dreams. Of course she was tired. He walked toward the back hallway that led to the small office and the kitchen. The stillness here was different. It felt heavy, oppressive. He could smell the faint, sharp scent of lemon cleaner. But underneath it, something else, something metallic and wrong. He reached the office first and peered inside. The door was open. The room was empty. The cash drawers, however, were pulled out. The money bags that should have been in the safe were gone. So, it was a robbery. The relief he had felt moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. If it was a robbery, where was Terry? He turned, his eyes drawn to the swinging door of the kitchen. It was propped open. "Terry, are you in there?" His voice was a strained whisper. He pushed the door. The kitchen was dark, but not completely. A single, pale rectangle of light from the back exit's small window cut across the tiled floor. He fumbled for the light switch, his fingers sliding against the cool plastic. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, and then flooded the room with a harsh, sterile brightness. Arthur saw her immediately. She was on the floor, not far from the walk-in freezer. He knew, instantly, that this was not a simple accident. This was not a fall. He saw her coat, the one she always wore, still zipped up. She had been preparing to leave. She had been on her way out, on her way home. He saw a plastic trash bag on the floor near her, a dark, crumpled thing that held a terrible significance he could not yet process. He saw that the scene was one of profound stillness, an image that burned itself into his mind with searing, permanent clarity. He did not move. He did not breathe. He simply looked, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him. He understood why the building was so cold. He understood the silence. Arthur backed away slowly, one step at a time, his hand feeling for the wall behind him. He did not take his eyes off the shape on the floor until his back hit the hallway. He turned and stumbled, nearly running, back to the front of the restaurant, his hands shaking so violently he could barely dial. He fumbled the receiver of the wall phone, dropping it once, before he managed to punch in the 3 numbers he needed. He gave the address, his voice a strange, high-pitched thing he didn't recognize. He said a robbery. He said the night manager was hurt. He hung up and slid down the wall, his back against the fake wood paneling, and stared at the front door as he waited. The 4th of February had begun, and for Terry Brooks, it had already ended. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the darkness, washing the brick facade of the restaurant in rhythmic, silent waves of color. They did little to push back the oppressive cold. Detective Whitney stepped out of his unmarked car, his collar turned up. The scene was already taped off, a perimeter of yellow plastic defining the edges of the tragedy. He saw the morning manager, Arthur, huddled in the back of a patrol car, a blanket around his shoulders, his face pale and empty. Whitney's partner, Detective Cloud, met him at the door. "It's not good, Whit," Cloud said, his voice a low rumble. He found her in the kitchen. Whitney nodded, his gaze sweeping the front. "Robbery?" "It looks that way," Cloud said. "Office in the back is a mess. Drawers pulled, bags gone. Seems they were on their way out and she walked in. We don't know yet." This was the narrative that wrote itself. A simple, brutal act of greed, a woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a story Whitney had heard before. It was a story that, in a town like this, was clean, if tragic. "Let's seal the office." "I don't want anyone in there," Whitney said, moving past the counter. He deliberately did not look toward the kitchen. Not yet. He let the forensics team do their work first. The living, and the leads they provided, were his priority. "We have a name," Cloud said, handing him a small notepad. "Terry Brooks, 25. Lived with her parents. We're about to send a car over to." A sound from the parking lot cut him off. A car, an older, sputtering model, had pulled in, its headlights flashing across the chaotic scene. It parked haphazardly, taking up 2 spaces. The driver's door flew open, and a young man, barely out of his teens, stumbled out. He was wearing work pants and a thin jacket, clearly not enough for the weather. He sprinted toward the yellow tape, his eyes wide. "What's going on? Where is she? Where's Terry?" A uniformed officer put his arm out, stopping the man's advance. "Sir, this is a crime scene. You need to stay back." "I'm not a sir. I'm Scott," the young man said, his voice cracking. "Scott Keith. Terry's my fiancé. I went to her house. Her car wasn't there. Her parents are going crazy. Is she here? Did she get held up?" Whitney and Cloud exchanged a look. This was new. This was complicated. Whitney stepped forward, under the tape, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Keith, I'm Detective Whitney. Why don't you come over here?" He guided the young man away from the building, toward his own car. "You're her fiancé?" "Yes," Scott said, rubbing his hands together, though it seemed less from cold and more from nerves. "We just got engaged. 2 months ago." "Look, what is this? What happened?" "She's okay, right?" Whitney leaned against the car, a barrier between Scott and the restaurant. He had to do this carefully. "Mr. Keith, there's been a serious incident inside." "An incident? Like a robbery? Is she hurt?" Scott's eyes darted back to the restaurant door, as if he could will her to walk out. "Terry is. She's inside, Scott. She's deceased." The words hung in the frozen air. Whitney watched the young man, cataloging the reaction. There were no immediate tears. There was a sharp, sudden intake of breath, a gasp, as if he'd been struck, Scott's head snapped back, and he looked up at the flat, purple sky. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not possible." He looked at Whitney, his eyes suddenly sharp. "I want to see her." "That's not possible right now, son. This is an active investigation." "Who did this?" Scott demanded, his voice rising. "Was it a robbery? Did someone come in?" "I told her this place was dangerous at night." "We are looking at all possibilities," Whitney said. "I need you to tell me about your morning. Tell me exactly what you did." Scott's story came out in a torrent. He was home. He was sleeping. He had to be up early for his own job, a construction gig across the river. He said he had a routine. He always drove by her parents' house, just to see her car in the driveway. It was his way of knowing she was home safe from her late shift. "But this morning," he said, his voice thick, "her car wasn't there. It just wasn't there. I got this awful feeling. I went and knocked on the door. I woke her parents up. They didn't know where she was. They thought she was with me. I told them I'd check the restaurant. I just drove here, and I saw the lights." It was a plausible story, a good story, the story of a loving, concerned fiancé. "When was the last time you spoke with her?" Whitney asked, his notebook out. Scott hesitated, just for a second, but Whitney saw it. "Yesterday afternoon, before her shift, she called me, just to say, you know, hi. And your relationship, everything was good?" "Good?" Scott laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "It was perfect. We were getting married." He looked down, finally scrubbing his face with his hands. "My God, I have to call her parents. I have to call my boss. I'm supposed to be at work right now." Whitney made a note. Worried about work. Shock, he told himself. People react in strange ways. People focus on the small, manageable details when the large one is too monstrous to comprehend. "Go home, Mr. Keith," Whitney said, handing him a card. "Be with her parents. We'll be in touch. We'll have more questions." Scott nodded, dazed. He walked back to his car, not as a man who had just lost the love of his life, but as a man who had been given a difficult task. He got in, the engine turned over, and he drove away. Cloud came up beside Whitney. "What do you think?" "I think," Whitney said, watching the taillights disappear, "that he was either in profound shock, or he's the calmest fiancé I've ever met." "He's young," Cloud offered. 23. Maybe he's just lost. Maybe. Whitney turned back to the restaurant. "But let's talk to her friends. Let's talk to everyone but him. He said the relationship was perfect. Let's see if anyone agrees with him." Later that day, they found a friend of Terry's. A young woman she used to work with at a different restaurant, before the promotion to manager. She was devastated, her eyes red from crying. "Terry was so happy about the manager job," the friend said, twisting a tissue in her lap. "She was so proud." "We were told she was engaged," Whitney said gently, to Scott Keith. The friend's expression tightened. The tears stopped. "Yeah, engaged." She used the word as if it were a weapon. "You don't sound happy about it." "Happy? He was a storm, detective. One minute, he was the most charming man on earth. They were intense, you know, all over each other. He couldn't stand for her to even talk to another man. She told me she thought that was passion at first." "And later?" Whitney prompted. The friend looked down. "Later, she called it what it was. Control. He was suffocating her. He was jealous of her job, of her friends, of me. He was in some kind of financial trouble, and he was dragging her into it." She looked up, her eyes pleading. "It was volatile. She was planning to end it. She told me she was going to tell him. She was just waiting for the right moment." Whitney felt a cold understanding settle in his gut, a feeling far colder than the February air. The clean, simple robbery homicide was already gone. In its place, something far more personal and far more terrible was beginning to take shape. The rest of that day was a blur of cold rooms, colder coffee, and the sterile hum of procedure. Detective Whitney was back at his desk long after the sun had set, the morning's grim discovery having bled all the light out of the day. The official story was taking shape on paper, a robbery, a tragic fatality. But the real story, the one that crawled at the back of Whitney's mind, remained stubbornly out of focus. Cloud dropped a thin file on his desk. "Preliminary," he said. He looked as exhausted as Whitney felt. Whitney opened it, scanning the pages. Empty drawers, empty bags. The money's gone. "So, it's a robbery." He said the word, tasting it. It felt wrong. "It's the cleanest motive we've got," Cloud said, pulling up a chair. "It's simple. It's random. It's what the papers will print." "Random?" Whitney looked up, his eyes hard. "That friend of hers, the one from the old job?" She painted a very different picture. She painted a fiancé who was intense. She painted a relationship that was about to break. "A friend's story," Cloud countered, though he lacked conviction. Maybe she was exaggerating. Maybe she was jealous. Scott Keith, on the other hand, was helpful. He gave a clear timeline. He was home. He was sleeping. "He was too clear," Whitney said. "He was worried about his job. He was worried about logistics. He didn't ask how she. He didn't ask the questions a man in love is supposed to ask. He just accepted it. Shock. Wit. We've seen it 100 times. Maybe." Whitney leaned back, the old springs of his chair groaning in protest. But shock doesn't explain the front door. Arthur, the morning manager, was clear. Terry was a hawk. She checked the locks 3 times. She never would have left it open. "So she was ambushed on her way out," Cloud said, mapping the theory. "Someone was waiting. They forced her back inside. They took the money. Things went bad." "That sounds plausible," Whitney admitted. He hated when things sounded plausible. It meant more work. But what does forensics say? As if on cue, the door opened and Jennings, one of the senior forensic technicians, walked in. He was a man who preferred objects to people. They rarely lied. "Detective," Jennings said, holding a clipboard. "You wanted the physical report." "Give it to me, Jennings," Whitney said. "What did we miss?" "You didn't miss anything. You just didn't know what you were looking at," Jennings said flatly. "First, there was a struggle, a significant one. Your victim was not passive. She fought. She fought very hard." Whitney sat forward. This was it. "Did she leave a mark?" "She did," Jennings said, a flicker of something like respect in his voice. "We found scrapings under her fingernails. Both hands, skin, epithelial cells, and a few strands of hair. They are not hers. We're typing them, but in 1984, that just tells us a blood type and a hair color. Still, it's something. It proves she was in contact with her attacker." "So, the ambush theory holds," Cloud said. "Maybe," Jennings said, looking at his notes. "Except for one thing, the locks. We did a full sweep. Back door, front door, all the windows, even the delivery chute. And nothing. Not a scratch. No pry marks. No shattered glass. No sign of a forced entry anywhere on the building. Whoever was in that restaurant with her, they didn't break their way in." A thick silence filled the small office. Whitney looked at Cloud. The ambush theory had just dissolved. "She knew them," Whitney said. "The pieces clicking into place. She let them in. Or they had a key. Or they came in with her before she even locked up," Cloud added. "That still leaves a robbery motive." "It does," Jennings said. "But it's sloppy. The violence was extensive. It was personal. This wasn't a clean in and out. This was rage." Whitney felt a grim satisfaction. She knew them. He looked back at Jennings. "Anything else? Something we can use?" "One last thing," Jennings said, flipping a page. "It's probably nothing, but we found it. That plastic trash bag you saw on the floor, the one near her face." Whitney nodded, remembering the crumpled black plastic. "It was a fresh bag, from a new roll," Jennings continued. "And it had one, perfect, latent fingerprint on it, right on the seam." Whitney and Cloud looked at each other. A print. A single, clean print. "A print," Whitney said, the word coming out as a command. "Run it." We are, Jennings said. We're pulling the employee files right now. We'll run it against everyone who worked there. Get their elimination prints. Good. Whitney stood up, the exhaustion gone, replaced by the familiar, electric hum of the hunt. Pull the employee files. Get me the list. And Cloud. Yeah? Find a reason to get Scott Keith to come back in. I want his prints. I don't care how you do it. Tell him he needs to sign a statement. Tell him he needs to identify her jewelry. I don't care. Get him in here. I want to know if our grieving fiancé has a habit of touching things that don't belong to him. The call from Jennings in forensics came late the next morning. Detective Whitney picked up on the first ring, his coffee growing cold beside him. We got a hit, Jennings said, his voice devoid of excitement. It was a simple statement of fact. Whitney's pulse quickened. He kept his voice even. The fiancé? No, Jennings said. We haven't gotten Mr. Keith's prints yet, so we can't rule him in or out. No, this was an internal match. The print belongs to one of the employees, a young woman who works the evening shift. Her name is on the file we pulled. A co-worker, Whitney said. The word felt heavy. He looked at Cloud, who was watching him from across the room. Bring her in. They brought her in less than an hour later. She was young, barely 20, and looked as if she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she clutched a crumpled tissue in one hand. She sat in the hard-back chair in the interview room and looked from Whitney to Cloud, her entire body trembling. Am I in trouble? She whispered. We just have some questions for you, Whitney said, his voice deliberately gentle. We understand you were a friend of Terry's. The young woman nodded, and a fresh wave of tears welled. She was. She was always so nice to me. She was teaching me the inventory. She was going to promote me. When was the last time you saw her? Cloud asked, leaning forward. The night it happened, she said. I worked with her. My shift ended at 10. I clocked out. She was in the office, doing the paperwork. She told me to go home, to get some rest. She said I looked tired. The irony of the statement seemed to hit her, and she choked back a sob. We know this is hard, Whitney said. We're just trying to piece together her last few hours. We found something at the scene, an item, and we found a fingerprint on it. The young woman's head snapped up, her fear palpable. A fingerprint? Yes. And the print, Whitney said, watching her carefully, is yours. The color drained from her face. She looked, in that moment, as if she might faint. Mine? But how? I didn't. I would never. We found it on the plastic trash bag, Whitney said. The one found in the kitchen, near Terry. The woman stared at him, her brow furrowed in a confusion so profound, so genuine, that Whitney already knew the answer. And then, as if a light had been switched on, her expression changed from abject terror to a sudden, dawning comprehension. Oh, she said, letting out a long, shaky breath. Oh, thank goodness. Cloud raised an eyebrow. Thank goodness? Yes, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush of relief. I thought. I don't know what I thought. The bag. Yes, of course. That was me. That was me. Explain, Whitney said, though he was already connecting the dots. Before I left, she explained, her voice stabilizing, Terry asked me to do one last thing. She was in the office, and she shouted out, Hey, before you go, can you reline the trash cans? The morning crew will thank us. So I did. I got the new roll of liners from the supply closet. I went into the kitchen. I pulled a new bag off the roll, and I must have touched it. I put it in the can. She looked at them, her eyes wide and pleading. I put the bag in the trash can. That's all. It was the perfect explanation. It was simple, logical, and had the unmistakable ring of truth. The fingerprint wasn't evidence of a crime. It was proof of an employee doing her job. The relief in the room was almost a physical thing. Thank you, Whitney said. That clarifies a great deal. They sat in silence for a moment as the young woman collected herself. She had gone from being a potential suspect to a key witness in a matter of seconds. "Is there anything else?" she asked, her voice small. "Actually," Whitney said, leaning forward again. "Yes. Now that we know you were there, we need to know what that night was like. Did anything seem strange? Out of the ordinary? Did Terry seem worried? Was she expecting anyone?" The co-worker thought for a long moment, replaying the night in her head. "No," she said finally. "That night was normal. It was just a normal shift. Slow. She was in a good mood. She was talking about her wedding. But not really." "Not really?" Cloud picked up on the hesitation. "Well," the woman said, she seemed stressed about it, not excited. She just said Scott was being Scott. And then she changed the subject. She seemed more worried about the restaurant. "The restaurant?" "Yes," she said. And now she seemed to remember something that pushed the fear away and replaced it with a spark of anger. Not that night, but a few days ago. It was near closing time. These two men came in. Whitney's pen was suddenly still. What men? I'd never seen them before. They were loud. They were aggressive. They smelled like they'd been drinking. They were demanding food, but the grill was already clean. Terry came out from the office to handle it. She was so calm. She told them the kitchen was closed and that they needed to leave. And did they? Not at first. They got ugly, especially the tall one. He started saying things to her, nasty things, calling her names. He said he knew her type, a little boss who thought she was better than everyone. What did Terry do? She stood her ground. She told them she was calling the police. That's when they finally started to leave. But the tall one, as he was walking out the door, he turned back. He pointed right at Terry. He said, "You'll regret that. You just made a big mistake." A new, potent narrative had just entered the room. A direct, public threat. "Did you ever see them again?" Whitney asked. "No," she said. "I never saw them again. Terry didn't even file a report. She just said, 'Forget it, they're just nobodies.' But it scared me. It really scared me." "Can you describe them?" Cloud asked, his voice all business. The young woman nodded. "The tall one. He had dark hair. And a scar, I think. Right here." She touched her own cheek. "The other one was shorter. He just laughed at everything," the tall one said. After she left, Whitney and Cloud stared at the empty doorway. The tidy, personal motive of a jealous fiancé had just been complicated by a far more volatile, far more public one. "Two men," Cloud said. "A public threat. A few days later, a robbery and a violent end." "It fits," Whitney said. The words a betrayal of his gut feeling about Scott Keith. It fits the robbery. It explains the rage. It explains everything. "So," Cloud said, "we're no longer looking at the fiancé?" "We're looking at," Whitney said, grabbing his coat, "two men with a grudge. Let's start canvassing. I want to know who these phantom men are. I want to know who else in this town they've threatened." The investigation had turned. They were no longer looking inward at the tangled, private passions of a broken engagement. They were looking outward into the cold, random violence of strangers. The investigation shifted. It was no longer a subtle, internal affair, a quiet look into the tangled passions of a young couple. It was now a manhunt. The co-worker's story had given the detectives something tangible, something they could take to the streets. The phantom men were real. They had names, or at least faces, and they had made a direct threat. Detective Whitney and Detective Cloud started the next day with a new sense of purpose, even if it was one Whitney privately distrusted. His gut was still tangled up with Scott Keith's strange detachment, but he was a professional. You follow the evidence. You chase the lead. They started with the basics, canvassing. They took the descriptions given by the young co-worker, one tall, dark-haired, a scar, the other shorter, a follower, and they walked. They went to every convenience store, every bar, every all-night diner within a 20-block radius of Terry's restaurant. At first, the lead felt strong. It felt hot. "Yeah, I seen him," said a grizzled bartender, wiping a glass. 2 nights ago, maybe 3. The tall one's got a mouth on him, tried to start trouble over the jukebox. I told them to get lost. They gave me some lip, but they left. Did you get a name? Cloud asked, his pen ready. The bartender laughed. I don't ask for names. I ask for cash. They paid. They left. That's all I know. It was a pattern that repeated all morning. At a gas station, the night attendant recognized the description instantly. Oh, those guys. Yeah. They were in here. Tall one tried to buy beer, but I told him it was too late. He got loud. Started swearing at me. His little buddy just kept laughing. I thought I was going to have to call the police, but they just left. Did you see what kind of car they were driving? Whitney asked. The attendant shook his head. Didn't see. They walked in from the street. They walked out. They were ghosts. They were a pair of aggressive, unpleasant apparitions who were drifting through the town, leaving a wake of intimidation, but never a name, never a license plate, never a solid, traceable piece of themselves. Whitney and Cloud returned to the station and widened the net. They put out a bulletin to surrounding townships. The descriptions were, they both knew, frustratingly vague. Tall man with a scar could describe 6 men in any given bar on a Saturday night. Days turned into a week. The week turned into 2. The investigation into the Phantom Men consumed all of the department's resources. They followed up on every vague tip. Every call about a loud argument, every report of a disturbance was scrutinized. They brought in dozens of local troublemakers, lining them up for the co-worker and the bartender to see. None of them were right. His eyes were different, the co-worker would say, shaking her head. Meaner. And the scar was sharper. That's not him. The promising lead, the one that had seemed so bright and clear, was diffusing. It was spreading out so thin that it was becoming invisible. The men were phantoms, just as Whitney had feared. He found himself, late one night, long after Cloud had gone home, staring at the Terry Brooks case file. It was already thick, full of dead-end reports on the 2 men, and in the very back, tucked away, was the initial interview with Scott Keith. Whitney read it again. He read about the drive-by, the missing car, the detached concern. He read the statement from Terry's friend, the one who described a controlling, jealous fiancé. He had followed the evidence. The evidence had led him to a brick wall. The Phantom Men were a plausible, even probable, solution, but they were also the perfect, convenient excuse. They were the answer that required no one to look closer at the people who were left behind. His superiors were satisfied that the department was doing everything it could. The public was satisfied that the police were hunting for the 2 violent strangers who had come to their town. But Whitney wasn't satisfied. He couldn't shake the feeling that while they were all staring out into the darkness, hunting for phantoms, the real answer was sitting right where they had left it, in a pizza parlor, in a new relationship, convinced he had gotten away with it. He had no proof. The fingerprint had been explained. The lack of forced entry could be explained by the Phantom Men forcing Terry back inside before she locked up. The robbery motive was clean. Every piece of evidence that pointed at Scott was circumstantial. Every piece of evidence that pointed at the 2 men was solid, corroborated by multiple witnesses. And yet, he closed the file. The investigation into Terry Brooks's terrible end had officially stalled. The trail had gone cold. The reports would continue, but the energy was gone. The case was, for all intents and purposes, being moved from the active pile to the unsolved cabinet. It would remain there, in the dark, for a very, very long time. The file on Terry Brooks moved from a detective's desk to a file cabinet. Then it moved from the cabinet to a cardboard box. The box was sealed with tape that yellowed over time, and it was placed on a metal shelf in a vast, quiet room where old reports went to be forgotten. The world outside that room changed. Seasons turned, one after another, blurring into a long, indistinct passage of time. A decade passed, and then nearly half of another one. The 1980s, with their sharp edges and bright colors, had bled into the softer, grayer cynicism of the late 1990s. The case was no longer cold. It was an artifact. The phantom men had never been found. They had dissolved back into the ether from which they came, remaining the official, unsatisfying answer. The year was now 1998. Scott Keith was no longer a 23-year-old construction worker. He was a man in his late 30s, and the years had not been gentle. The youthful, intense passion that Terry's friend had once described had curdled, hardening into something brittle and suspicious. He was working at a pizza joint. It was a job, not a career, and he treated it with the same simmering resentment he treated most of his life. He stretched the dough, he spread the sauce, he answered the phone, and he watched the clock. This evening, he was watching it with a growing fury. He was supposed to be off. His shift had ended. He was waiting for his current girlfriend, a woman named Brenda, to pick him up. She was late. He untied his apron, his movements jerky and aggressive. A teenager working the counter glanced at him. "Hey, Scott, maybe she's just stuck in traffic." "Traffic," Scott repeated, the word a curse. "Right, traffic. That's always the story." He stalked over to the payphone on the wall, his knuckles white as he gripped the receiver. He punched in the numbers to her apartment, his home. It rang. He counted the rings. 1, 2, 3, 4. He let it ring a fifth time, and a sixth, before her voice, small and cheerful on a recording, asked him to leave a message. He slammed the phone back into its cradle with a crack of plastic that made the teenager flinch. "You don't know anything," Scott snapped, seeing the boy watch him. When Brenda's car finally pulled up, he stormed out of the restaurant without a word to anyone and wrenched the car door open. "You're late," he said. It was not a question. "Scott, I am so sorry," Brenda began, her voice placating, nervous. "My boss, Mr. Harris, he needed me to stay and close out." "Your boss," Scott said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You mean Mr. Harris? You're on a first-name basis with your boss now? How nice." "What? What are you talking about?" she asked, pulling away from the curb. "He's my supervisor. I have to talk to him." "You were supposed to be here," Scott said, his voice a low, grinding monotone. "You said you would be here." "I was standing there, waiting, looking like an idiot. Where were you before you got in the car?" "I called the apartment. No one was there." "I was at work, Scott, just like I said. I went straight from my desk to the car." "You're lying," he whispered. "I am not," she cried, her voice finally breaking. "Why do you do this? Why do you always do this? You twist everything. You make me feel watched all the time. I can't even be 5 minutes late without you thinking I don't even know what." "You can't be late because you're spending my money," he suddenly shouted, veering into a different, safer lane of anger. "The bills, I saw them. You think I don't see where it's all going? You think I'm stupid? You're careless. You're just careless. You don't think about the consequences." "This is suffocating," Brenda said, her voice small and tight with unshed tears. I can't live like this. It's not normal." Scott turned his head and looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw her fear, her frustration. It was a familiar look. It was a look he had seen before, in another woman's eyes, on another night, a lifetime ago. "You're just like her," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "Like who?" Brenda asked, confused, her anger momentarily forgotten. "Like your ex-wife? Who are you talking about?" Scott just shook his head, turning to stare out the side window at the darkness rushing by. "It doesn't matter. Just drive. You're giving me a headache." He had difficulty maintaining relationships. They were always intense, always passionate at the start, but they always ended. They ended in slammed doors, in tears, in accusations. They always ended when the women in his life began to pull away, when they began to see the man behind the charm. 14 years had passed. The file was in a box. The detectives had moved on. And Scott Keith, working in a pizza joint, was still the same man, trapped in the same patterns, waiting for a past that he thought was buried to finally, inevitably, be unearthed. In the quiet, climate-controlled basement of the Falls Township Police Department, Time was measured in shelf life. The unsolved homicides were categorized, boxed, and stored, each one a silent monument to a failure. For 14 years, the box marked with Terry Brooks's name had sat undisturbed. That changed on a Tuesday in 1998. Detective Sergeant Cloud, a man whose face now carried the lines of every case he hadn't closed, stood before that shelf. He was older than the ambitious young detective who had first worked the case. He remembered the frustration. He remembered the phantom men and how they had evaporated under scrutiny, leaving the case hollow. He pulled a heavy cardboard box, the tape brittle and yellowed. He carried it upstairs, to his desk, the air in the squad room, thick with the smell of stale coffee and new reports. He cut the tape. Inside, the file was immaculate. The evidence logs, the witness statements, the autopsy reports. They were artifacts from another era of police work. A younger detective, Nelson Whitney, stopped by his desk, a half-eaten sandwich in his hand. "What's that, Sarge? Your memoirs?" Cloud didn't look up from the file. Terry Brooks, 1984. The fast food manager. Whitney paused, swallowing. "The Phantom Men case? I read about that in training. They never caught those guys, did they? The ones with the scar?" "They never caught them," Cloud said, his voice flat. He turned a page, a photo of the cash register. "Because I'm not sure they ever existed." Whitney pulled up a chair. "What do you mean? I thought that case was solid. Public threat, robbery gone wrong. It was tragic, but it made sense." "It made sense," Cloud agreed. "It was the only thing that made sense at the time. It was the loudest, most obvious lead. So, we followed it. We followed it right into a wall. I was there, Whitney. It never sat right. Not then, and not now." "So why now?" Whitney asked, intrigued. "Why pull this box?" "The new chief wants all unsolved homicides re-examined," Cloud said. "A fresh look. And this one is different." He tapped the thick evidence manifest. They saved everything. Everything. The scrapings, the other items. It was all processed and preserved beautifully. It's all just sitting in an evidence locker, waiting. "Waiting for what?" "Waiting for us," Cloud said. "Waiting for 1998. Waiting for technology that wasn't science fiction when we were busy chasing phantoms." Deputy District Attorney Lori Markle, sharp and pragmatic, had heard Cloud was digging up graves, as she put it. She walked over, her arms crossed. "Sergeant, I hope this isn't just a nostalgic exercise. My office has a very limited budget for retesting evidence, especially on a case this old with a clear motive." "With respect, Lori, the motive is the one thing I'm not clear on," Cloud said, pushing the file toward her. "The entire investigation hinged on it being a robbery. It was violent, it was messy, and it was blamed on two strangers. But the evidence never quite fit. No forced entry. A fingerprint that was explained away, maybe too easily. We had tunnel vision. We wanted it to be the strangers." Whitney, catching Cloud's drift, picked up a report. The fiancé, Scott Keith. His alibi was thin. "His alibi was that he was asleep," Cloud said. "And we just believed him. Because we were busy chasing the men with the scar." Markle sighed. "Scott Keith, you're going to try and build a case against a man 14 years later, a man who was cleared at the time, all based on a gut feeling?" "Not a gut feeling," Cloud said, his voice firm. "On evidence. On the physical evidence that has been sitting in a box, waiting for science to catch up to it. What if the robbery was a performance? What if the phantom men were just a lucky coincidence that threw everyone off the trail?" He looked from Markle to Whitney, his eyes holding a conviction that had been dormant for more than a decade. "I'm reopening this file," Cloud announced. "And we're going to do it right. We're going to ignore the phantom men. We're going to ignore the robbery theory. We're going to start from scratch. We're not investigating a robbery. We're investigating a homicide. We're going to find out who Terry Brooks really was, who was in her life, and who might have had a personal, passionate reason to want her gone." Markle looked at him, unconvinced but seeing the fire in his eyes. You have 2 weeks, Sergeant. Bring me something new. Not a theory, not a feeling, something tangible. Or that box goes back on the shelf, for good. 2 weeks, Cloud said, nodding. When she was gone, Whitney looked at Cloud. Where do we even start? We start, Cloud said, opening a fresh notebook with her. We find her friends. We find her family. And we find out everything we can about the fiancé, Scott Keith. It's time to learn who he really was. 14 years is a lifetime. It is long enough for grief to sharpen into a permanent dull ache, a piece of furniture in the room of a life that you learn to walk around. For Terry's parents, the arrival of Detective Sergeant Cloud and Detective Whitney was an intrusion from a past they had been forced to bury. They sat in their small, quiet living room, the same one they had sat in 14 years ago when the first terrible knock came. "Detectives," Mr. Brooks said, his voice thinned by age. "This is unexpected. We thought this was finished. We thought you had decided it was those men." "We are re-examining some older cases, sir," Cloud said, his voice gentle. He knew he was walking on hollow ground. "We have new perspectives, new procedures. And we wanted to start, respectfully, with you." "There's nothing new to say," Mrs. Brooks said. She held a teacup, but she was not drinking. "They took our daughter. They were never found. That is the story." Cloud leaned forward, his hands clasped. This was the moment. "Ma'am, Mr. Brooks, we are not reinvestigating the robbery. We have reasons to believe that the robbery may not have been the primary motive. We're looking at the case from a new direction. We are here today to ask you about Terry, and about her relationship with Scott Keith." The name, spoken aloud by a police officer after so long, hung in the air. Terry's parents looked at each other, a silent, pained communication passing between them. "Scott," Mr. Brooks said, the name tasting like ash. "We haven't seen that young man since the funeral." "What do you remember about him?" Whitney asked, his notebook open. "About his relationship with Terry?" "It was fast," the mother said, finally setting the cup down. "She was our bright girl. So ambitious. She put herself through college. She was so proud of that manager's job. And then, Scott. He was intense. He was always there. He would call the house 10, 12 times a night if she was out with her friends. At first, we thought it was just young love. We thought it was passion. And later, Cloud prompted. "Later," she said, her voice dropping. It looked like something else. It looked possessive. Terry started to change. She stopped going out. She seemed smaller, always looking over her shoulder. She told me he was having money troubles, that he was dragging her into them. She was worried. "And the morning, Mr. Brooks added, his voice growing stronger, a 14-year-old anger returning. "I never forgot that. When he came to the door, he was upset, yes, but it was a strange upset. When we found out, when the police confirmed, his first real reaction was to look at his watch," he said. "He said he didn't want to be late for work. He refused to go to the hospital to identify her. He said he had to work." Whitney wrote it all down. This was not the story of a grieving fiancé. "She was planning to end it," Mrs. Brooks said, the words a quiet confession. "She told me about a week before. She said she couldn't breathe. She said she was afraid of his temper. She was just working up the courage." "Did she write any of this down?" Cloud asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Did she keep a journal? A diary?" "A diary?" The mother shook her head. "No, not a diary. But Terry, she was a planner. She was so organized. She kept everything. She looked at her husband, her things, in the attic." Cloud and Whitney exchanged a look. "Ma'am," Cloud said, "would it be possible for us to see those things?" The attic was quiet and cold. Mrs. Brooks pointed to a single sealed cardboard box. We couldn't bring ourselves to go through it. Not really. We just packed it away. It's It's just as she left it. They brought the box down to the living room. It was a time capsule. Old photographs, a high school diploma, a small stuffed animal, a few pieces of inexpensive jewelry, and, at the bottom, a 1984 day planner. Whitney picked it up. It was bound in a faux leather blue. He opened it. The pages were full of Terry's neat, looping handwriting. Shift, 8 hours, inventory, call Brenda. He flipped to January, then to February. His fingers stopped. The first week. He traced a line with his finger. An entry, written just 2 days before that final night. In the small box for the 2nd of February, she had written, "He's too much. I can't breathe. Have to end it." A cold silence fell over the room. Whitney's hand was shaking, just slightly. He turned the page to the 4th of February. The day was blank, as she had not lived to fill in what happened. But in the small square for the evening, for the hours when she would have been at the restaurant, there was a single, chilling notation. 3 words, written with a final, decisive-looking underline. "Tell Scott, tonight." Whitney closed the planner. He looked up at Cloud, and then at Terry's parents. The phantom men had vanished. The robbery was a ghost. This was tangible. "Mr. and Mrs. Brooks," Cloud said, his voice thick with a new, cold certainty. "We believe this is the key. We believe this is the motive. We've been looking for the why for 14 years, I think. I think we've finally found it." The thin, blue-bound planner sat on Detective Sergeant Cloud's desk. It was an object of almost terrible power. It was the why. It was the voice of the victim, reaching across 14 years, to correct the narrative. "Tell Scott, tonight." The words had re-energized the investigation. They had a motive, one that was deeply personal, primal, and a world away from the cold randomness of the phantom men theory. Cloud and Whitney took the planner, along with the parents' new testimony, directly to Lori Markle. She read the final entry. Her professional skepticism, her concerns about budgets and old evidence, vanished. She just stared at the page. "My goodness," she whispered. "You found it. You found the reason." She looked up, her mind already working, processing the implications. But this creates a logistical problem. A huge one. "The original theory," Whitney said. "Already there." "Exactly," Markle said. "The entire case file is built on the premise that she was ambushed on her way out. She was wearing her coat. The phantom men theory was built on it. A robbery gone wrong. This diary. This suggests an appointment, a confrontation, a planned conversation. It suggests she was inside. The unlocked door," Cloud said, thinking aloud. "The original team assumed she was forced back in. But what if," Whitney countered, "she just let him in?" She was going to have the conversation. She knew he was coming. She hadn't locked up yet. "It's a strong theory," Markle said, "but it's just a theory. How do we prove it? How do we disprove the original ambush finding? We need more than the diary. We need to break the original timeline." Cloud was silent for a long moment, staring at the old evidence logs. "The original investigators," he said slowly, "were looking for a robbery. So they saw a robbery. They weren't looking for a personal dispute. What if? What if the crime scene photos tell a different story? What if we've all been reading them wrong for 14 years? We need someone who can read that scene," Whitney said, catching his partner's meaning. "Not a cop. Not a detective. We need someone who knew her, someone who knew her work." It took them 2 days. The fast food restaurant had changed hands twice, but they found him, running a small diner 3 towns over. He was a man named Evans, the former district manager who had trained Terry Brooks, the man who had promoted her. He came in, confused, a little wary. He sat in the same interview room that the co-worker had sat in, all those years ago. "This is about Terry," he said, more a statement than a question. "After all this time, we're re-examining the file," Cloud said. We need to understand what we're looking at. You knew her. You knew how she worked. You trained her." "I did," Evans said, a flicker of pride in his eyes. She was the best I ever had. Meticulous, a perfectionist. She would have owned her own franchise one day. What happened to her? It was a loss. Whitney slid a set of photographs, the original crime scene stills, across the table. He did not show the photos of the kitchen. He showed the ones of the small, cramped manager's office. "We need you to look at these," Whitney said. "Tell us what you see. Does anything seem out of place?" For Terry, Evans put on a pair of reading glasses. He picked up the first photo, a wide shot of the office. He studied it. "Well, it's a mess. But the police had been through, I assume." "This was taken before the scene was processed, sir," Cloud said. "This is as it was found." Evans' demeanor changed. He looked closer. He picked up the next photo, a close-up of the desk. He was silent for a long time. He just stared at the 8x10 glossy. "This is wrong," he said, his voice quiet. "What is, Mr. Evans?" Cloud asked, leaning in. "This," Evans said, his finger tapping the picture. "Her desk. It's all wrong." "It's messy," Whitney offered. "The drawers are open. We know about the robbery." No, Evans said, shaking his head impatient. "Not the robbery. That. The desktop." He tapped the photo again. "Look, her ledger is open. The calculator is out. And that? The ashtray. The ashtray? It's in the middle of her desk. And it's full. Or at least, it has ashes in it." "Was she a smoker?" Whitney asked. "Not in the office," Evans said, his voice firm. "Never. She was. Meticulous, like I said. That ashtray, it was her ritual. The very last thing she did before she left that building, every single night, was empty that ashtray, wipe it clean, and place it on the small shelf above the desk. It was her "I'm done" signal. It was her clocking out." Cloud and Whitney exchanged a look. It was a small, cold spark. Seeing it like this, Evans continued, his mind clearly back in 1984, full, on her desk, next to an open ledger and her calculator. "This doesn't mean she was getting ready to leave." The air in the room was suddenly still. "What does it mean, Mr. Evans?" Cloud asked, his voice low. "It means she was in the middle of her work. It means she was right in the middle of closing out the books for the night. She was working." The original ambush theory, the foundation of the entire case, shattered. The coat she was wearing was not because she was leaving, but because the heat was off and the building was cold. She was working late. Whitney, remembering another detail, slid one last photograph across the table. It was a shot of the floor beneath the desk. "And her shoes," Whitney said. "They were found here, by the desk." Evans looked at the picture and let out a long, sad sigh. He nodded, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Of course they were. She always kicked off her shoes when she was doing the books. She said she couldn't concentrate in heels. She'd sit there, just in her socks, and run the numbers. He pushed the photos back, his face grim. The truth, buried in the details of a messy desk, had been sitting there, waiting, for 14 years. "Detectives," Evans said, looking up, his eyes clear and certain. She wasn't ambushed by strangers on her way out. She was sitting right there at that desk. Whoever did this, she was working when they arrived. She let them in. She knew them. The air in the district attorney's office was different. The skepticism that had clouded Lori Markle's features just days before was gone, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of a prosecutor who smelled a conviction. The why, the simple, devastating diary entry was laid on the conference table. The how, the manager's testimony about the ashtray and the shoes, was laid beside it. "So," Markle began, pacing the room, "we have a new case. We have a new narrative. The original investigation is officially irrelevant. Terry Brooks was not ambushed. She was not the victim of a random, violent robbery by strangers. She was murdered by someone she knew, someone she let in, someone she was working beside just moments before it happened." "Scott Keith," Detective Whitney said, the name now an indictment, not a question. "Scott Keith," Markle agreed. "A spurned fiancé. A man who was about to be told no. A man whose possessiveness, as described by her parents and friends, was about to be challenged. We have a motive. We have a timeline. We have, for the first time in this investigation, a coherent story. She stopped pacing and slammed her hand down on the file. But here is what we do not have. We have nothing physical. We have nothing that ties him, and only him, to that room. A good defense attorney will tear this apart. They will say she was ending it, yes, but she was sad, and she let the phantom men in. They will use our own department's original theory against us. They will say we are railroading a grieving fiancé to close a cold case. We have to do more. The evidence, Detective Sergeant Cloud said, his voice a low rumble. He had been waiting for this. We have the physical evidence. The scrapings from under her fingernails, the hair, the weapon itself. It's all been sitting in our locker for more than a decade. Exactly, Markle said, and in that time, science has had a revolution. I am authorizing a full retest of every single item. We're going to send it to the state lab. We're going to test for this new DNA technology. If he struggled with her, if she scratched him, his signature is on her. We will find it. There was a silence as they all absorbed the weight of this. They were, in effect, opening a scientific dialogue with the dead. That's one part of the puzzle, Cloud said, and he did not seem as relieved as Whitney had expected. The lab will give us a what. It might even give us a who. But it won't give us the why in a way a jury can feel. The defense will call the violence random. We need to prove it was personal. We need to prove the rage. Markle crossed her arms. What are you suggesting, Sergeant? I'm suggesting, Cloud said, that we've been looking at this as a small-town homicide. It's time to bring in experts who do not think that way. I've been making some calls. There is a group, a private brain trust, based in Philadelphia. They are not official, not in the way we are. They are a collection of the best minds in the country. Forensic experts, profilers, seasoned detectives, psychologists. They are called the Vidocq Society. Whitney had never heard of them. Markle looked, for the first time, skeptical again. A society? Markle asked, her voice laced with doubt. You want to bring in a club of retired detectives to help us? They are not retired, Cloud said, his voice firm. They are the best. They are the ones who pioneered criminal profiling. They are the ones who look at a crime scene, the one we so badly misread, and can build a complete, undeniable portrait of the man who did it. They will look at the violence in our file. They will look at the staged robbery, the personal nature of the incident. They will tell us who we are looking for. They will give us the psychological architecture of our suspect. They will, in effect, hand us Scott Keith's mind on a platter. He leaned forward, his conviction filling the room. This case was cold because we were chasing phantoms. The science, the DNA, that's our first new weapon. But the why, the rage, that's our second. We need to understand the profile of this killer. We need to prove that the violence was not about money, but about possession, about being spurned, about an anger so profound it could only come from someone intimate. Markle was quiet for a full minute. She looked at the blue diary on the table. She looked at the photograph of the messy desk. All right, Cloud, she said, finally. You've earned this. We fight on two fronts. I will get the warrants. I will get the lab prioritized. We will find his biological trace. She turned to Cloud. And you go to your Society of Minds. You get your profile. When we finally bring Scott Keith in, we are going to walk into that room knowing more about him than he knows about himself. The weeks that followed the meeting with Laurie Markle were a new kind of cold case. They were a purgatory of procedure. The evidence, the carefully preserved scrapings from 14 years ago, the plastic bag, and the weapon itself was packaged and driven under armed guard to the state crime lab. And then there was only silence. Detective Sergeant Cloud found himself checking his voicemail every hour. Detective Whitney chain-smoked, his energy from the diary discovery now coiled into a tight, vibrating anxiety. They had done everything they could. They had resurrected a ghost, but now they had handed it over to people in white coats, and they could only wait. The call came on a gray, unremarkable afternoon. Cloud snatched the receiver before the second ring. "Sergeant Cloud." "This is Diane Marshall," a voice said. It was crisp, precise, and held no emotion. "I'm the forensic scientist assigned to your Falls Township 1984 case. The Brooks file." Cloud motioned frantically for Whitney, who immediately stubbed out his cigarette and ran over to the desk, leaning in to listen. "We have your findings," Marshall said. Cloud held his breath. And, Marshall said, it was not a simple request. 14 years, Sergeant. 14 years of degradation, of storage. The samples were compromised. But the original technicians, I will say, did their job correctly. They were preserved dry and dark. "The scrapings," Cloud said, his voice tense, "under her fingernails. What did you find?" "As expected, the epithelial cells were badly degraded," Marshall explained, her voice like a professor's. "The genetic material was fragmented. But our new sequencing techniques are very good. I was able to isolate and amplify a partial profile from 2 of the samples. It is a male profile. It is not in any database we have. For our purposes, we are calling it Unknown Male 1. Cloud felt a sharp sting of disappointment. "That's it? A partial profile of an unknown man? That just tells us what we already knew. She fought someone." There was a dry chuckle on the other end of the line. "Sergeant, I was not finished. That was the obvious evidence. That was the appetizer. The real work, the real finding, was the weapon, the knife," Whitney whispered, his eyes wide. "The knife," Marshall confirmed. "It was problematic. The original report said it was wiped clean. And it was. Superficially. There were no prints. There was no visible trace. It was just a knife. But I was not interested in the blade. I was interested in the seam." "The seam?" Cloud asked. "The point where the wooden handle meets the metal blade," Marshall said, her voice finally showing a glimmer of excitement, the thrill of the puzzle. "A handle like that, it's 2 pieces of wood affixed to a metal tang. That tang, the metal that extends from the blade into the handle, is not a perfect fit. There are gaps. There are crevices. A killer wipes down a handle. They wipe down a blade. They do not, as a rule, disassemble the weapon." Cloud and Whitney were silent, picturing it. "I took the knife apart," Marshall continued. "I removed the pins. I separated the wood from the steel. And there, Sergeant, deep in the seam, protected from air, protected from cleaning, protected from decay for 14 years, was a small, almost microscopic, deposit of material. It was a time capsule." "My God," Cloud said. "I processed that specimen," Marshall said, her voice turning sharp and professional again, "and I found everything. The sample was rich. It contained 2 distinct DNA types. The first, quite clearly, belonged to your victim, Terry Brooks. And the second?" Cloud asked, though he already knew the answer. "The second," Diane Marshall said, "was a perfect, complete, undeniable match to Unknown Male 1, the exact same profile we found under her fingernails." The implications hit them with physical force. Whitney sat down hard in the nearest chair. Cloud gripped the edge of his desk. The science had closed the loop. The phantom men were gone forever. The robbery was a lie. The man Terry Brooks fought in her final moments was the same man who held the weapon. The attacker was the killer. They were not 2 different people. They were not strangers. They were one and the same. "Sergeant Cloud," Marshall said, "you do not have a robbery. You have a personal, violent, one-on-one confrontation. The science is absolute. The man she scratched is the man who killed her." Cloud hung up the phone. He looked at Whitney. They did not celebrate. The news was too grim, too final. The science had given them the who in the most definitive way possible. They had their ghost. They had his genetic signature, a thread of evidence pulled from the very heart of the weapon. Now, Cloud said, his voice a low, cold engine of certainty. We just have to find a name for Unknown Male 1, and I know exactly where to start looking. The revelation from Diane Marshall's lab was a seismic event. The man Terry Brooks fought was the man who held the weapon. The science had confirmed, in a language no jury could ignore, that this was not a robbery. It was a personal execution. But the science, for all its power, had delivered an incomplete answer. It had given them a detailed portrait of a ghost, Unknown Male 1. They had a motive, thanks to the diary. They had a new timeline, thanks to the ashtray. And now they had a genetic fingerprint. But they did not have a name. The three of them, Cloud, Whitney, and Markle, were back in the conference room. The file was open. So, here we are, Laurie Markle said, her voice sharp. We have the most powerful piece of evidence imaginable, a DNA profile, and it is completely, utterly useless. It's not useless, Whitney countered. We know who we're looking for, Scott Keith. The motive is his, the opportunity is his, the diary points to him. It has to be him. It has to be is a theory, Detective, Markle said. It is not a fact. I cannot go to a judge and say, I have a gut feeling, and I also have a diary from a dead woman, so please grant me a warrant to forcibly take Scott Keith's blood. He would throw me out of his chambers. Worse, we would alert Keith. He would lawyer up, and we would never get a second chance. The case would be over. For good this time. She was right. They were standing at the very edge of the truth, separated from it by a single, impassable wall of legal procedure. They could not compel him. They could not ask him. So, what do we do? Whitney asked, the frustration making his voice raw. We just stop? Detective Sergeant Cloud, who had been silent, finally spoke. His voice was low and thoughtful. No, we don't stop. We just change our approach. He looked at Markle. You're right. We can't compel him. He has a right to privacy. He has a right to refuse. But that right, Cloud said, a grim, old-school cunning in his eyes, ends at his curb. Whitney looked confused, but Markle's expression sharpened. She understood. Abandoned property, she said. Abandoned property, Cloud confirmed. It's a legal, valid, and defensible path. Anything he discards, anything he puts out in a public space, is, by legal definition, abandoned. It is no longer his. It is ours. And if that abandoned property happens to contain his genetic signature, we can take it. You want to go digging through his trash, Whitney said, the reality of it setting in. I want to find Unknown Male 1, Cloud said. And Unknown Male 1 lives in that house. He eats, he drinks, he shaves, he likely smokes. The plan was set in motion, but it was not simple. Surveillance began. It was a tedious, grinding return to basic police work. Cloud and Whitney, two senior homicide detectives, found themselves sitting in an unmarked car, hours on end, feeling like rookies. They watched Scott Keith, now a middle-aged man, a creature of habit. They watched him work at the pizza joint. They watched him go home to his girlfriend. They watched his routine. He's careful, Whitney noted after 3 days, his eyes sore from the binoculars. He's not throwing anything away. He doesn't smoke on the street. He doesn't toss a cup in the bin. He's been careful for 14 years, Cloud said. He's not going to make it easy. They documented his entire life. They saw the arguments with the girlfriend. They saw the casual arrogance he had with his co-workers. He was exactly the man the profilers from the Vidocq Society had described. A man who believed he was smarter than everyone. A man who had built a life on a foundation of lies and had come to believe them himself. And then they found the opening. Tuesday, Whitney said, flipping through his notebook. Trash day is Tuesday. He takes the cans to the curb himself. Every Tuesday night, like clockwork. We can't just take the can, Cloud said. It's commingled. His girlfriend, Brenda, lives there. If we find a DNA sample, how do we prove it's his and not hers without a warrant for her too? No, we need something that is only his. They discussed stakeouts. They talked about his breaks at the pizza joint. But it was too risky, too public. The trash can was the only way. "Then we have to get lucky," Whitney said. "No," Cloud said. "We don't get lucky. We get smart." He picked up his phone. "Laurie, I have a new plan. It's unconventional. We're going to need a garbage truck and a driver." The night of the operation was cold and still. Cloud and Whitney were parked at the end of the residential street. They had been there for hours. At 3 in the morning, a municipal garbage truck rumbled to life, its engine a low growl in the suburban silence. It drove past house after house, its hydraulic arm stilled. It did not stop. It did not collect. It was, for all intents and purposes, invisible, until it reached Scott Keith's address. The truck stopped, the arm extended. A single, precise movement. It grabbed the one can, lifted it, and dumped its contents into the empty, sanitized hold. The can was replaced. The truck's compactor did not engage. The truck rumbled on. A block away, it pulled over, its lights off. Cloud and Whitney pulled in behind it. The sanitation workers, 2 other detectives in overalls, opened the back hatch. "It's here, Sarge," one of them called out, holding up a single, tied-off kitchen bag. They laid the contents on a sterile blue tarp on the side of the road, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. It was a collection of the mundane: empty milk cartons, junk mail, vegetable peelings. And then Whitney saw it. "Sarge, look." His light was focused on a small, clear glass ashtray, the kind that came free with a case of beer. It had been dumped, unemptied, into the bag. It was full, and among the gray ash and crumpled paper were several cigarette butts. They were a specific brand. They were the evidence of a man's private habit, tossed away without a second thought, abandoned to the world. Cloud looked at the butts, then at Whitney. "Let's get these to Diane Marshall," he said, his voice flat and cold. "It's time to put a name to Unknown Male 1. The plastic evidence bag containing the ashtray and its contents did not arrive at Diane Marshall's lab with flashing lights. It was logged in with the same mundane precision as every other piece of evidence that crossed a threshold. But Marshall, who had lived with the Brooks file for weeks, knew exactly what it was. She understood the legal dance the detectives had just performed on the curb of a suburban street. She knew they were waiting. Her work was not, as television suggested, a single, dramatic moment of discovery. It was a process, a meticulous, patient, and often frustrating process of elimination. She put on her gloves. She looked at the contents of the ashtray. It was not just one type of cigarette. She noted, with a professional's eye, that there were 2 different brands in the mix. One was a popular, premium brand. The other was a less expensive, generic label. This was not a small detail. It was a complication, but it was also an opportunity. It suggested 2 different smokers. She began her work. She would not, she decided, test them all. She would test one of each. She selected a butt from the premium brand first, the filter stained. She carefully, painstakingly, went through the process of extracting the cellular material from the saliva. She amplified what she found. She ran the sequence. A few hours later, a clean, complete DNA profile appeared on her screen. It was a perfect sample. She pulled up the file for Unknown Male 1. She laid the 2 profiles side by side. They did not match. It was a jarring, cold stop. The new profile was viable, clear, and completely unrelated. It was a female profile. This was, she realized, the girlfriend, Brenda, the woman who lived with Scott Keith. Diane Marshall felt a twinge of, not disappointment, but clinical frustration. The detectives had gone through all that effort, the surveillance, the coordinated trash pickup, all to bring her a sample from the wrong person. It proved nothing. The defense would say the ashtray was communal. Of course, her DNA was in it. But Marshall was not a detective. She was a scientist. And she was, above all, thorough. She had not finished her work. She went back to the evidence. She selected a butt from the other brand. the cheaper, generic label. She started the entire process over. The extraction, the amplification, the sequencing. It was late now, the lab quiet around her. There was just the low electronic hum of the machines. The second profile rendered. This one was different. It was male. Marshall's heart, despite her professional detachment, began to beat a fraction faster. She pulled up the master file again, the one that contained the fragmented, partial profile from under Terry Brooks's fingernails, the one that contained the complete, perfect profile from the dark, hidden seam inside the knife handle. She placed the new sequence, the one from the discarded cigarette, next to the file of unknown male 1. She looked. She checked the markers. She checked them again. She ran the comparison sequence. The screen flashed a word: match. It was not a partial match. It was not a similarity. It was not a high probability. It was an identity. It was a 100%, irrefutable, scientifically absolute identity. The saliva from the cigarette, the trace from the weapon, and the skin from the victim all belonged to the same single individual. Unknown male 1 was no longer an abstract. He was no longer a ghost in a 14-year-old file. He was the man who smoked the generic brand cigarettes. Diane Marshall picked up her phone. She did not wait for the morning. She dialed Sergeant Cloud's direct line. He picked it up as if he had been sitting on top of it, waiting. "Sergeant," she said, her voice as flat and calm as she could make it. "This is Marshall. I'm calling about the evidence you submitted this morning." "Go ahead, Diane," Cloud said. His voice was a tight wire. "I processed the contents of the ashtray," Marshall said. "I found 2 distinct profiles. One was female, not relevant." Cloud said nothing. He waited. "The second profile," Marshall continued, "the one from the other brand of cigarette. It's a complete, viable, male profile. I ran it against the sample you have designated unknown male 1, the one from the weapon and the victim." She paused, taking a breath, allowing herself a single moment of professional gravity. "It is a match, Sergeant. A positive, 100% identification. The DNA on the cigarette is the same as the DNA on the weapon. You have him." The silence on the other end of the line was heavier than a shout. When Cloud finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough thing, the sound of 14 years of weight finally settling. "Thank you, Miss Marshall," he said. "Thank you for your work." He hung up the phone. He looked across the desk at Whitney, who had watched the entire conversation, his face a mask of tension. "Well?" Whitney demanded. Cloud stood up. He picked up the Scott Keith file, the one that had started with motive and theory. He closed it with a soft, final thud. "It's him," Cloud said. "The lab just confirmed it. Scott Keith is unknown male 1. The file was no longer a theory. It was a weapon. The lab report from Diane Marshall, with its irrefutable, scientifically bonded link, was the core. But it was not the only piece. Cloud, Whitney, and Marshall had spent 2 full days in a locked conference room, building their case. They had the motive, the planner, with its heartbreakingly simple entry, "Tell Scott, tonight." They had the new timeline, the manager's testimony about the ashtray and the shoes, which proved she was working, not leaving. They had the psychological profile, the report from the Vidocq Society, which described a man with a deep, narcissistic rage, a man who could not handle rejection, a man who would be prone to staging a scene to deflect blame, a man whose passion would, under pressure, turn to possessive, ultimate violence. And now they had the identity, the DNA from the cigarette, a perfect, absolute match to the man who held the weapon, and the man Terry Brooks scratched in her final, desperate moments. "We have him," Lori Markle said, her voice a flat, hard line of certainty. "We have Scott Keith. The warrant is a formality. It's done." Detective Whitney was already on his feet. "I'll take the warrant. We can have a team at his house in 20 minutes. We'll take him at his pizza joint. In front of everyone." "No." The word came from Detective Sergeant Cloud. It was quiet, but it stopped Whitney cold. "Sarge?" Whitney said, confused. "We've waited 14 years. We have him. It's over. It's not over, Cloud said, his eyes on the file. It's not over until he's in that room. You go in hard. You take him at work. He lawyers up before his hands are even cuffed. We will spend the next 2 years fighting motions. The DNA will be challenged. The diary will be called hearsay. The timeline will be called speculation. He will try to turn this entire thing into a trial about our procedure. He's right, Markle said, understanding. Scott Keith has had a long time to build his lie. He believes it. His defense will be that we, the original, incompetent investigators, are now trying to railroad him to close a cold case. We have to be surgical. Cloud looked at the calendar on the wall. He pointed to a square. We don't go to him. We bring him to us. We do it on our terms, and we do it then. Whitney looked. The date Cloud was pointing to was the 4th of February. The anniversary, Whitney whispered. The 15th anniversary. There is a power in that, Cloud said, a psychological weight. It's the perfect day to dismantle a lie. The plan was not for an arrest. It was for an invitation. Cloud made the call himself, his voice a perfect, calm, bureaucratic instrument. Mr. Keith, this is Detective Sergeant Cloud, Falls Township. I'm hoping you can help us. The silence on the other end of the line was, for a moment, absolute. Then, Scott's voice, older, but with the same familiar arrogance. Detective, it's been a long time. What can I do for you? We're finally closing the books on the Terry Brooks case, Scott, Cloud said, using his first name, the word a carefully chosen tool. It's the 15th anniversary, and we're just tying up loose ends. We wanted to bring in the people who were closest to her, the important witnesses, just to get a final sign-off, to help us finally bring some peace to her family. Another pause. A calculation. Scott thought he was being invited in as the grieving fiancé. He thought, after all this time, that they were still just as lost as they were in 1984. Yeah, Scott said, his voice clearing. Yeah, of course. I can help. Anything. When do you need me? How about tomorrow? Cloud said. The 4th. Around 10 in the morning. I'll be there, Scott said. When Scott Keith walked into the station, it was exactly 15 years, almost to the hour, since Terry's body had been found. He was not in cuffs. He was a witness. He was cooperative. He was arrogant. So, he said, sitting in the interview room, Cloud and Whitney opposite him, you're finally closing it. That's good. Did you ever find those 2 men? The ones who threatened her? We're here to talk about that, Scott, Cloud said, his voice neutral. We appreciate you coming in. You're a very important witness. And because this is the final, official step, we're doing it by the book. As a matter of routine, we're going to have an expert join us, just to verify your original statement. Scott's smile wavered, just for an instant. Expert? What? What expert? A polygraph examiner, Whitney said, his voice flat. Mr. Bill Flesher, from the Vidocq Society. It's just a formality. To clear you, to confirm your original statement, so we can finally, officially, rule you out and focus on the other avenues of the investigation. It was a perfect trap. The arrogance that had protected Scott for 15 years was now the very thing that was destroying him. He could not, in this moment, refuse. To refuse would be to admit guilt. To accept was to walk into the machine. He tried to laugh. The sound was dry and thin. A polygraph? After all this time? You're kidding. Okay, fine. Whatever you need. I've got nothing to hide. Hook me up. Cloud nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Scott's. The game was over. The lie had reached its end. Mr. Flesher, Cloud called toward the door. If you're ready. Bill Flesher stepped out of the room. The door closed with a soft, final click. It was, for a moment, just the 3 of them. Scott Keith sat there, attempting a smile, a brittle, thin-lipped expression that did not reach his eyes. He was trying to regain the casual arrogance that had been his shield for 15 years. Well, Scott said, his voice a little too loud. That was interesting. A lot of questions. So, am I free to go? Did I pass your little test? Detective Sergeant Cloud did not answer immediately. He just looked at Scott, his gaze heavy and patient. When he spoke, his voice was not accusatory. It was a simple, cold statement of fact. The machine indicates you're being deceptive, Scott, Cloud said, on every single relevant question about the night Terry Brooks died. Scott's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of anger. Deceptive? That's ridiculous. Those things are junk. They don't work. I'm nervous. You drag me in here on the anniversary. You ask me these things. Of course I'm nervous. That doesn't mean anything. That's not proof. You're right, Detective Whitney said, his voice cutting in, sharp and clear. It's not proof. It's just a guide. So let's forget the machine. Let's talk about the proof. Let's talk about the desk. Scott's head snapped toward Whitney. The desk? What desk? I don't know what you're talking about. Terry's desk, Whitney said. Let's talk about the ashtray. The one she always cleaned before she left. The one that was full, sitting next to her open ledger. Let's talk about her shoes, Scott. The one she always kicked off when she was doing her paperwork. A flicker of genuine confusion crossed Scott's face, quickly followed by suspicion. I don't know. How am I supposed to know her habits? It was 15 years ago. That's just nothing. It's not nothing, Scott, Cloud said, picking up the thread. It's everything. It proves she wasn't leaving. It proves she wasn't ambushed by strangers on her way out. She was working. She was in that office, and she let someone in. Someone she knew. Someone she trusted enough to turn her back on. Scott's anger was a tangible thing now. He was leaning forward. This is a setup. I told you. I told all of you. Back then. It was those two men. The ones who threatened her. The ones with the scar. You knew about them. You had your suspects. You dropped the ball. You were incompetent. And now, 15 years later, you're trying to pin it on me to cover your mistake. He was good. He was using their own, original, failed investigation as his shield. But Cloud did not flinch. We know all about those men, Scott, but we're not here to talk about them. We're here to talk about this. Cloud's voice changed. He was no longer just speaking. He was presenting the first piece of the new case. Her planner, Scott. Her personal planner. We found it. Scott's face, for the first time, went completely, utterly still. An entry, just 2 days before. He's too much. I can't breathe. Have to end it. And then, on the day, Scott, the 4th of February, in the box for that evening, tell Scott, tonight. Cloud's voice was a low, devastating monotone. What was she going to tell you, Scott? What was it that she had to end? No, the word exploded from Scott. That's a lie. She wouldn't. We were in love. We were passionate. We were getting married. That's just some scribbling. It doesn't mean anything. You're twisting it. It meant she was ending the engagement, Whitney said. She was rejecting you, and you couldn't have that. So you went to the restaurant that night. Not to go to sleep. You went to see her. You went to stop her. I was asleep, Scott shouted, his voice cracking, the arrogance replaced by a raw, desperate fury. I was home, and I was asleep. I've said it for 15 years. You can't prove I was ever there. You have nothing. We have everything, Scott, Cloud said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The room was suddenly, terribly, quiet. We are long past the diaries. We are past the ashtrays. This is 1998. We have science. The kind of science you could never have imagined. Scott just stared at him, his mouth slightly open. She fought, Whitney said, his voice methodical. We know you know that. She fought you, and she scratched you. She took a piece of you with her. We found the skin under her fingernails. We built a profile. We called him Unknown Male One. Scott's eyes darted between them. He was calculating. He was trapped. But that wasn't all, Cloud continued. We found the weapon, the knife, and we took it apart. And Diane Marshall, at the state lab, found a trace, deep inside the handle, protected. And the DNA from the knife, Scott, was a perfect match to the skin under her nails. The man she fought was the man who held the weapon. Unknown Male One was the killer. Scott was breathing hard, but he said nothing. He was still calculating. They have a profile. They don't have me. But we still had to find him, Whitney said, delivering the final, inescapable line. We still had to give Unknown Male One a name. So we watched you, Scott. We went to your house. We collected your abandoned property. We found your cigarette butts, the generic brand. Scott's face went white. It was a physical draining of all life. And the lab ran the sequence, Cloud said, his voice as final as a judge's gavel. The saliva on the cigarette, the DNA from the knife, the skin under her nails. It's not 3 different men, Scott. It's one man. It's you. It has always been you. You are Unknown Male One. It is over. The silence in the room was absolute. The fury was gone. The denial was gone. The arrogance, built up over 15 years, had crumbled to dust, leaving only the small, hollow man behind it. When Scott finally spoke, his voice was a choked, unfamiliar sound. A whisper. It wasn't. It wasn't supposed to happen. And then, the confession. The dam of 15 years breaking. She told me, he whispered. The words barely audible, just like the book said. She was ending it. She said I was. Too much. That I was, suffocating her. She was, rejecting me. Me. After everything, I saw red. I snapped. The passion. It was just too much. I got so angry. And she fought. I didn't mean for, but she fought. She fought me. So hard. And the robbery? Cloud asked, his voice still quiet, still relentless. I had to, Scott said, the words coming faster now, as if purging them. I had to make it look like something else. I remembered the story she told me. About those men. So I took the bags. I messed up the office. I left the door open. I went home. I washed. And I went to sleep. He looked up, his eyes empty. The 15-year-long lie was over. Cloud stood up. Scott Keith, he said, and his voice was formal, the voice of the state. You are under arrest for the murder of Terry Brooks.